In this video, we're going to focus on designing out the sidebar section of our website. So we'll be adding the content inside of here along with a few little featured widgets and designing out some testimonials. So the first thing we want to do is have a couple of graphics over here or imagery to show maybe some featured projects or things we're currently working on. So in order to get those images, I'm just going to come over to the finished website and take a screenshot of the design here. Now you can pull whatever image you'd like and use it for your featured image, but I'm just going to hold down Apple Shift 4. I'm on a Mac to take a screenshot, and I'm just going to pull out maybe a section like this and screenshot this. I guess I'll go a little bigger because I can crop it down in Photoshop. And once I've taken a screenshot of that, I'll jump back into Photoshop and I will say File, Place. Now, once I say Place, it's going to ask me where that photo is, and I can just select it off my desktop. There's that screenshot. Hit OK, and hit the check mark to place that object. Whenever you import objects from using the Place command in Photoshop, they automatically come in as smart objects. So that gives me the freedom to be able to resize and to rotate this and to do all sorts of commands without actually destroying the pixels. So I can resize this at a later date. As long as I don't go bigger than the original size, I can resize as many times as I'd like. So before I play around with this little sidebar image, I want to organize a little bit the layers that I created for my navigation. So let's select all of the layers that make up the navigation and group them into a folder, and we'll just call that Nav for navigation. All right, now I'm down here on this screenshot, and I'm going to free transform it again, and I want to rotate it just a little bit like this. So it's kind of off to the side, rotate it. I'll come back into 100% so you can see that, and I'll move it over into this section here, and that looks about right. Now I actually want to create a mask, a square mask around this area of this featured item. So I will select the mask, make sure this layer is highlighted, and click the mask to add a layer mask. And I'm going to get my Marquee tool, the rectangular Marquee tool, M's the keyboard shortcut there. And I'm just going to drag out a rectangle here, just rough in a size. I want it to be a little bit smaller than the actual sidebar width, which is why I'm kind of eyeballing down here. If you hold down space, you can move this around and then let go of space and you can continue to work with it. So I'll maybe make it about so. All right, and then I'm going to hold down the Option key to move into subtraction mode and just cut off the bottom half of this because I only want this to be a rectangle shape. And then once I have my mask selected, I can fill this area with black. So I'll move to black and do the Option Delete to cut that piece out. Now if you look at the mask, right now it's white everywhere and black in the middle, so it's hiding the black. What I want is the exact opposite. So if I select the mask, I can press Command I, which is inverse. It's the inverse command. You can find that up there in the select as well. And that essentially inverts the mask, and so now it's black everywhere and white in the middle. And that's exactly the way I want it. And now I can move this layer up into position, and then I can tweak the image independently from the mask. If I click this little chain icon in between the two layer icons there, it will unlink them, and then I can move the mask independently of the image or the bitmap image, or I can select the bitmap image and move it independently of the mask, whichever. So I'm going to undo that so it positions itself there again. So I want to select the bitmap image, and I'm just going to maybe drag this around to a spot maybe like that for this image. All right, once that's done, I'm going to add in the shadow. I'll select the pixel mask again. I'm going to turn back on the linkage there, so now I can move them as a unit if I want to. And I'm going to add a stroke to this image. So let's go to the FX menu, which is the layer styles, and I'll come in and add a stroke. So I'll select stroke and I'll move this over to the side a little bit so we can kind of see how this is going to affect our image. And I want to add a black stroke, and I want my stroke size to be about 8 or 10 pixels. So I'll just set 10 pixels. I want to set the position of the stroke to be on the inside of the object, so it's on the inside of my image rather than on the outside. If you set the stroke to the inside, you'll notice you get hard squares. So the miter joints will actually be squared. Whereas if you set it to either center or outside, you actually get rounded bevels on those miter joints. So inside is what I want. And then I'm going to take the opacity and bring that down a little bit. Now you'll notice kind of a quirk here that although this is set to the inside, if I turn this off, you'll notice the image actually extends past the stroke. But as soon as I turn on the stroke, even if I bring down the opacity there, it's almost cutting out part of the image, which is a little bit odd. So we're actually going to add another effect to this in order to make it so that it's on the inside. So we'll crank this all the way up to 100%. I just wanted to demonstrate what happens if you change opacity on a stroke that's set to the inside, and select OK. And then we'll come back to this layer and we'll talk about these two toggles, the opacity toggle and the fill toggle. If I change opacity, that affects the entire layer itself. So you can see the entire layer is changing the opacity. And if I change fill affects only the layer itself without affecting the layer styles themselves. Okay, so that's the difference between opacity and fill. Now, what I really need to do is I need to separate the fill from the stroke, or essentially separate the pixels of the layer from the stroke. And there's a command in Photoshop that'll let us do that. The command that lets us do that is actually underneath the effects. If you right-click on the effects, you'll want to move down to the option that says Create Layer. And as soon as I select Create Layer, you'll notice that it actually splits the layer styles from the layer itself. So now my stroke, which used to be a layer style, is now a pixel-based layer, and it's attached above that, and it's clipping mask. It's using a clipping mask to attach it to the bounds of this layer. The clipping mask can be selected by holding down the Option key and clicking in between the two layers. That will unclip or clip that layer. Or you can right-click and say Create or Release Clipping Mask. But now that this layer is essentially split apart, or this stroke, I can change the opacity of the stroke and bring that down to something in the 20 to 30% range. So the effect I want is I just want this little subtle border of stroke on the inside of that. So I'll leave it at 30% for now. All right, next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of a call out action, or maybe we could call this a tagline for this particular image to kind of describe what this image is about. In order to do that, we're going to be creating a shape layer down below here. So let's come over to our shape layers. Now thus far we've strictly been working with the rectangle tool. This time we're actually going to switch and use the rounded rectangle tool. So select the rounded rectangle tool, and the rounded rectangle tool is essentially like the rectangle tool. The only difference is it works with a radius, and this radius value determines the amount of curve that is in each one of the corners of your boxes. Now if you're using Adobe CC, which is the Creative Cloud version, you can actually edit those radius values on the fly and after the fact. So that's kind of a benefit, or one of the features that Adobe's touting for the Creative Cloud. If you're using CS6 or below, you need to make sure that you set the radius value before you create the shape, because once the shape is created, you're not allowed to change that radius value at all. So kind of be aware of that. Now, because I'm using CC, I can leverage that, and I can just visually make changes to the radius right here, which is quite handy. So I'm going to change the shape here a little bit and free transform that and pull this up. And we'll just set that like so. And I'm going to free transform these corners and pull that out a little bit, because I want this to roughly be the same width as my image up here. And that looks about right. So now I can kind of pull that into position. And you'll notice actually one issue that I didn't notice over here in my layers panel is this rounded rectangle is actually clipped to this shape, which I don't want. So I'm going to drag this way upside of here out of that clipping mask so that it's just its own independent layer. So if yours it was accidentally inside of there, drag it up out of that clipping chain. So now I can nudge this thing up into place. and I'll stick it underneath here. Now that looks about right. So if you're, I'll show you how you can do that if you're using CS6 or below. So if I was doing CS6, I would need to make sure to set the radius value of what I want, and then I could create a shape. But if you create a shape like this in CS6 or below and you free transform it, it will actually deform the curve or the radius value of your corners. So in order to get around that, you actually have to get the white arrow tool and select the bottom half of your shape and then nudge it up. Whoops, and I've actually selected the background shape, but you get the idea. And then nudge it up. And if I need to make it longer, I would select the left half and pull it out or push it in. So that's how you would have to free transform if you're on 6 or below. But with the cloud version, you can just simply free transform and it will maintain those radius values. So I'm going to delete that shape and just work with this one here. So I'm going to free transform it one more time. Just pull this down just a hair bit. All right. Now I'm going to set the background color of this shape. Right now it's just set to black, but I'm going to change the fill to a color, a shade here. So I'll just choose maybe a light gray for now. I can change this later. And what I want to do is I want to make this thing look inset, so it's pushed in a little bit. Now before I do this, I'm going to change the background color of the sidebar. Right now it's just this dark gray color that we worked with from our wireframe. And I want to set that to kind of a specific color. So I'm going to set that right now. The color of that sidebar I've got predetermined. So I'm going to come in here and double click the sidebar, and it's going to be F1, 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 which is just a really, really light shade of gray, and hit OK there. And now that that's set to a little bit better color, I can kind of see how I want to do the inset on this call out box. I've got a predetermined color that I want to set for this little call out box. So I'm going to select that layer and double click it and paste in a hex value I have, which is EBEAE5, which is kind of this light yellow color. All right, next I'm going to add a couple of layer styles to make it look like this is inset or pushed in. So I'm going to come down to my FX, and the first one I'm going to do is add a drop shadow. So I'm going to select drop shadow, and the color I want, it's almost the inverse of a drop shadow. So I'm going to actually select white for the color, and I'm going to set this to normal, and I'm going to set this to 90 degrees. And you can kind of see that it's adding this slight white edge down here. And what I want to do is I want to play around with the size and spread values. So I can take the distance. You can see the distance is just how far away it goes from the shape, and I want to pull the distance down. The spread and size I want to take all the way down. So size is 0 because I don't want this to be really blurry at all. I don't want there to be any feathering. I want it to be solid. And then I can take this size and pull that down to just maybe 1 or 2 pixels. We'll kind of see. We'll leave it at 2 for now. Maybe we'll adjust that in just a second. Okay, so that gives us a bottom highlight, and then I want to add a top shadow. So I'm going to do an inner shadow for that next effect, and you can see that adds that inner shadow. And I want to take the distance and pull that way down because I just want it to be in the top. And the size I want to choke down as well. So maybe distance is going to be maybe the same thing, 1 or 2 pixels. And then size is going to be the same thing, choked all the way down to 1 or 2. And I'm going to take the opacity on this and bring the opacity back quite a bit because it shouldn't be quite as intense. So we'll maybe pull that back to 20% and call that good for now. So I'm going to select OK. So I've got this inner shadow and this drop shadow, which is creating this effect that is called an inset effect. It's almost like this is pushed in. And then I'll get my type tool, and I'm going to create a new layer here above the rounded rectangle, and just come in here and say this is the call out text for the featured image. And obviously I can't see that text because it's white, so I'll double click that and choose a text color which I can actually see, and we'll position that inside of there, fix the spelling errors that I could not see I was making. All right, and what we'd probably want to do is set this text color to be one of the color scheme colors. So again, I've got this orange text up here. Maybe I want to match that text down here. So I'm going to double click that text and fill that with the orange color from my swatches. Whoops, I selected the wrong layer. Let's undo that. I meant to double click the text layer and fill that with that orange color there. And then I can play around with the font or the font size. Maybe I want this thing to be in small caps or something like that. So I can click the little clipboard icon there and I can play around with the settings. Maybe I want to change this to small caps and play around a little bit with the font size. And then to center this, I can select this layer and the layer below it. I want the text to be exactly centered inside of this. And then I can just align this along the vertical center and the horizontal center. And that text will be perfectly aligned in the middle of that callout box. So that one is done. So the next video is we'll kind of duplicate this, change it around a little bit, add a heading here for our sidebar, and continue to work on our sidebar area.